In the small town of Caldwell, Idaho, in 2014, life seemed measured and predictable. Families lived in cozy houses with neat lawns, children played in parks, and locals discussed the weather and upcoming town holidays. In one of these houses on the outskirts of town lived a couple, 32-year-old Emily Wilson and her 35-year-old husband David Wilson. They had been married for 3 years, and from the outside their marriage seemed stable. Both worked, Emily at the local school, and David at a construction company. Neighbors considered them an ordinary couple who were planning to have children and making plans for the future. However, in October 2014, the quiet life of the town was disrupted by an event that shocked everyone. Emily learned a secret that David had kept from her for many years, and this secret led to tragic consequences that changed their lives forever. The story began with a seemingly insignificant moment. Emily, checking her husband's email, came across a strange letter. It was sent from an unfamiliar address and contained hints about David's past, about which Emily knew nothing. Curiosity turned into alarm, and she began asking questions. The answers she received turned her world upside down. David was not who he seemed, and his secret was tied to his identity. This truth became the starting point for a chain of events that led to irreversible consequences. The story, based on true events, reconstructs the chronology of the case, relying on testimonies, police reports, and interviews with those who knew the couple. In early October 2014, Emily Wilson sat at the kitchen table in her home on Maple Street. It was around 8 p.m., and she was waiting for David to come home from work. He was running late, which was becoming increasingly common these days. Emily, a soft-featured woman with a warm smile, was an elementary school teacher and known in Caldwell for her kindness. Her life revolved around work, home, and her plans for the future with David. They had married in 2011 after dating for 2 years. David, a tall man with short dark hair, was a man of few words but seemed dependable. He worked as a foreman for a construction company and often took overtime to save up for a home expansion. That evening, Emily decided to check David's email. His laptop was open in the kitchen, and she knew the password. They shared things like that without suspicion. Emily wasn't looking for anything specific, but an email from the day before caught her eye. It was from an address she didn't recognize, and it said just a few lines. "You can't hide forever. She needs to know who you really are." Emily read the message several times, trying to figure out what it was talking about. The sender was listed as Chris, with no last name. She checked the other emails, but nothing else matched it. This was the only message, and it looked like a warning. Emily closed her laptop and tried to distract herself, but the words from the email wouldn't leave her head. When David got home around 9 p.m., she greeted him with a smile, but inside she was filled with questions. At dinner, she asked if he knew anyone named Chris. David, without looking up from his plate, said it was probably an old acquaintance from work and quickly changed the subject. Emily found his reaction odd. He was usually more forthcoming. Over the next few days, she began to notice little things she'd previously ignored. David often locked his phone, went to another room to talk on the phone, and avoided discussing his past. A week later, on October 10th, Emily decided to check her laptop again. She found another email from the same sender. This time it was longer and hinted that David was hiding something important about his life before marriage. The email mentioned old photos and documents that the sender said would explain everything. Emily felt her heart beat faster. She didn't know what to look for, but she decided to talk to David directly. That evening, she waited for him to get home and asked, "Is there anything you haven't told me?" David looked at her with surprise, but his answer was evasive. He said he had no secrets and suggested that she ignore the strange emails, which were probably spam. But Emily couldn't calm down. She started looking for information on her own. Over the weekend, she went through old boxes of David's belongings that were stored in the garage. Among the documents, old receipts, and photographs, she found a folder with his birth certificate and other papers. The certificate had the name David James Wilson, but something about the document struck her as odd. The date of issue was relatively recent, 2008. Emily was no expert, but it raised questions. She also found an old photograph in which David looked different. His hair was longer, and his features seemed softer. On the back of the photograph was the inscription, 2005, Seattle. Emily decided to contact the sender of the letters. She responded to the last message with a direct question, "What do you know about my husband?" The answer came 2 days later, on October 12th. The unknown person, who introduced himself as Chris, wrote that he was ready to meet and tell everything, but only in person. He suggested meeting in a neighboring city, Nampa, at a cafe the following week. Emily hesitated, but curiosity and anxiety prevailed. She agreed without telling David about her plans. At that moment, she did not yet know that this meeting would be the first step in revealing a secret that would destroy her world. By the end of the week, David's behavior had become even more withdrawn. He began spending more time away from home, citing work as the reason, and avoiding long conversations. Emily, for her part, felt that her marriage, which she had considered strong, was beginning to crack at the seams. She had no idea how far the consequences of her quest for the truth would go. On October 15, 2014, Emily Wilson drove to nearby Nampa, Idaho, to meet a man who signed his name as Chris. She told David she was going to school on business and left her home around 10 a.m. The cafe they had chosen for the meeting was Sunrise Cafe, a small place in downtown Nampa with wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Emily arrived early and grabbed a table by the window. Her heart pounded as she waited for the stranger who claimed to know the truth about her husband. At 11:05 a.m., a man in his 40s, average height, with short blonde hair and a dark jacket, walked into the cafe. He introduced himself as Chris Larson and got straight to the point. Chris said he knew David in the 2000s when they both lived in Seattle. According to him, David was a completely different person back then, not only in personality but also in appearance. Chris claimed that David was born under a different name and led a life Emily knew nothing about. He hinted that David was hiding his true identity, tied to his past, but refused to go into details without proof. Chris handed Emily a flash drive, which he said contained old photos and documents that supported his words. He advised her to look at the files, but warned that the truth might shock her. Emily listened carefully, trying to remain calm. She asked Chris why he had decided to contact her only now. He said he had recently found out where David lived and felt he couldn't keep quiet. Chris didn't elaborate on his past with David, but his tone was serious, without a hint of humor. The meeting lasted about half an hour, after which Chris left, leaving Emily with a flash drive and a lot of questions. She returned home at 2 o'clock, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. At home, Emily plugged the flash drive into her laptop. It contained several folders with photographs and scanned documents. The first folder contained pictures of a young man who resembled David but looked different. Long hair, softer features, and clothes that weren't his current style. In some of the pictures, he was with other people, including Chris. The dates on the pictures ranged from 2003 to 2006. In another folder, Emily found a copy of an old driver's license from Washington State. The name on the document was Danielle Wilson, and the gender was listed as female. Emily read the information several times, trying to figure out what it meant. She also found medical records dating back to 2007 that mentioned procedures that involved changing her appearance. Emily spent the rest of the day going through the files, her thoughts in a tangled mess. She tried to remember if David had ever mentioned anything about his past, but he had always been evasive, saying that his life before moving to Idaho had been uninteresting. Emily knew that he had been born in Oregon, moved to Seattle as a teenager, and then settled in Idaho, but he hadn't shared any details. Now she began to suspect that David was hiding more than just minor anecdotes, but something fundamental about his personality. That evening, when David returned home, Emily decided not to mention the meeting or the flash drive. She watched him, trying to find clues in his behavior. David behaved as usual. He ate dinner, watched TV, and went to bed early. But Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, wondering how to broach the subject that could ruin their marriage. The next day, October 16th, she decided to seek help from a friend, Laura Clark, who worked at the local library and had access to databases. Laura met Emily at the library after work. Emily told her about the letters, the meeting with Chris, and the contents of the flash drive, without going into detail. Laura suggested searching public databases for information on Danielle Wilson. They found several records associated with the name, including an address in Seattle that matched where David said he lived in the 2000s. However, most of the records were outdated, and they found nothing concrete about Danielle's connection to David. Laura advised Emily to be careful and not jump to conclusions, but Emily couldn't stop herself. She sensed the truth was close, and she was determined to find out. Over the next few days, Emily began asking David oblique questions about his life in Seattle. She mentioned old photos, friends, places, hoping he would spill the beans. David responded evasively and sometimes with an unusual irritable response. By October 20th, the tension in the house was palpable. Emily noticed that David was checking his phone more often than before, and once caught him deleting messages. She also received another email from Chris, asking if she had looked at the flash drive and was ready to talk further. Emily didn't respond, but her resolve grew. She began planning how to ask David directly about Danielle and the documents. By this point, Emily was no longer sure who to trust. She doubted her marriage, the man she loved, and herself. Her quest for the truth was becoming increasingly risky, but she had no idea that the situation would soon spiral out of control. By October 22, 2014, Emily Wilson was at her wit's end. Weeks of doubt, secret searches, and tense conversations with David had worn her down. She couldn't pretend anything was wrong any longer. Documents and photos from a flash drive Chris had given her confirmed that David had been hiding a significant part of his life. Emily was certain he had been born Daniel Wilson and had identified as a woman in the past. The truth left her with a mixture of shock, anger, and pain, but she wanted an explanation from David himself. That day, she decided to have the conversation that would set the record straight. Emily called off work that morning, citing illness. She stayed home to prepare. Her plan was simple: show David the printed copies of the documents and the photos from the flash drive and ask for an explanation. She laid out the papers on the kitchen table: a driver's license in the name of Danielle Wilson, medical certificates, and some photos from Seattle. Emily wasn't sure how David would react, but she was prepared for any outcome. She also texted Laura Clark, her friend, to tell him she was going to talk to her husband and to call him that evening to make sure everything was okay. David arrived home around 6 o'clock. He looked tired, but when he saw Emily sitting at the kitchen table with a serious expression, he pricked up. Emily invited him to sit down and got straight to the point. She asked him if he knew who Danielle Wilson was. David froze, his face pale. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably a distant relative, but Emily wouldn't let him get away with it. She placed a printed ID and photos in front of him. "That's you, isn't it?" she asked, trying to sound calm. David was silent for a long moment, looking at the documents. Then he admitted that he was born Daniel and had lived as a woman in the past. He said that in 2007, he began the process of transitioning, changing his name and appearance to live as a man. He said he moved to Idaho to start a new life and did not tell Emily about his past because he was afraid of her reaction. He insisted that he loved her and wanted to protect their marriage. Emily listened, but her emotions got the better of her. She felt betrayed, not so much by David's transgender past, but by the fact that he had kept it from her for 3 years. The conversation quickly degenerated into an argument. Emily asked why he didn't trust her, how he could build their marriage on a lie. David, in turn, accused her of going through his personal things and contacting Chris, whom he called someone from the past who wanted to hurt me. He admitted that Chris had been a close friend of his in Seattle, but that they had parted ways because of a conflict. Emily demanded to know everything, but David refused to talk about the details, claiming that it didn't matter. Tensions grew, and voices grew louder. Neighbors later told police they heard screams coming from the Wilsons' home around 7 p.m. By 8 o'clock, the argument had reached its climax. Emily said she wasn't sure she could continue the marriage knowing David had lied to her. She gathered up some of the paperwork and said she needed time to think things through. David tried to stop her by grabbing her arm, but she broke away and went into the bedroom, closing the door. At the time, it seemed like just an emotional row, but it became a turning point. Emily spent the night in the bedroom, and David stayed in the living room. On the morning of October 23rd, she called Laura and told her about the conversation. Laura suggested that she take a break and perhaps see a marriage counselor. Emily agreed, but said she wasn't ready to see David yet. Emily spent the day trying to gather her thoughts. She wrote to Chris, asking what else he knew about David's past. Chris replied that he was willing to provide more information, but only if Emily guaranteed that David would not find out about their correspondence. Emily agreed, and Chris sent more documents, including old letters in which David, then Daniel, discussed his plans for the future. These letters confirmed that David was deliberately hiding his past in order to start fresh. Emily began to suspect that David might be hiding not only his identity, but other aspects of his life as well. Meanwhile, David's behavior became increasingly erratic. He called Emily from work, begging for a chance to explain everything, but she asked him to leave her alone. David's co-workers later told police that he was distracted and irritable during those days, often leaving work early. On the evening of October 23rd, David returned home and tried to talk to Emily again. She refused to leave her bedroom, and he spent the night in the spare room. Tensions in the house reached breaking point, and both felt their marriage was on the rocks. Emily began to consider her next steps. She contacted a lawyer to inquire about divorce proceedings and scheduled a consultation for the following week. She also began packing, planning to move in with Laura temporarily. However, she was unaware that her actions and continued contact with Chris were causing David increasing anxiety. He began to suspect that Emily might reveal his secret to others, which could ruin his reputation in the small town. By October 24th, the situation at the Wilson house had become explosive. Emily and David barely spoke, but their silence was filled with mutual mistrust. Emily was unaware that David had begun to look for ways to stop her investigation, and her own search for the truth was pushing her dangerously close to the brink. By October 25, 2014, the Wilson home in Caldwell, Idaho, had become a place of mistrust and tension. Emily Wilson continued to gather information about her husband David's past, becoming increasingly convinced that he was hiding not only his transgender identity but other aspects of his life from her. David, for his part, was becoming increasingly withdrawn and nervous, feeling like his carefully constructed life was unraveling. The events of the next 2 days would prove pivotal in this tragic story. On the morning of October 25th, Emily woke up early and decided to check her email. She found a new message from Chris Larson, who had sent another batch of documents. Among them were copies of old bank statements in the name of Danielle Wilson, as well as a letter written by David in 2006. In this letter, he mentioned that he wanted to leave everything behind and start a new life where no one would know about his past. Emily also found references to debts that David, then Daniel, had accumulated in Seattle. This discovery made her wonder if Chris's actions were connected to a desire to blackmail David. She wrote to Chris, asking why he was so persistent in sharing information. Chris quickly responded. Chris claimed that he was acting out of a sense of justice, but did not specify what exactly connected him to David. Emily decided it was time to take action. She copied all the files from the flash drive to her laptop and saved them on an external hard drive, which she hid in a drawer with her files. She also contacted a lawyer, confirming an appointment for October 28 to discuss a possible divorce. Emily felt that she could no longer live with a man who had kept the truth from her for so many years. However, she was still hesitant to tell anyone about the situation except Laura Clark. She was afraid that in a small town, news of David's past would spread quickly, and it could hurt them both. Meanwhile, David began to suspect that Emily was continuing to dig into his past. That day, he noticed that his laptop was open, even though he clearly remembered closing it. He checked his browser history and discovered that Emily had searched for information about transgender transitions and the legal aspects of changing one's name. This discovery sent him into a panic. David called a coworker and said he would not be coming into work, citing a family emergency. Instead, he stayed home and began monitoring Emily's activities. He noticed that she would often retreat to her bedroom with her laptop and speak on the phone in hushed tones. David also found a printed copy of an old photograph in the trash that Emily had used during their argument. On the evening of October 25th, David tried to talk to Emily again. He knocked on the bedroom door and asked her to come out. Emily agreed, but the conversation quickly turned into an argument. She accused David of not only hiding his past, but also possibly financial problems that she had learned about from the documents. David denied everything, claiming that his debts had long been repaid and that Chris was trying to ruin their marriage. He begged Emily to stop communicating with Chris and give him a chance to fix things. Emily replied that she could not trust him and needed time. She returned to the bedroom, leaving David in the living room. The next day, October 26th, Emily decided to move in with Laura temporarily. She packed a bag of things and wrote to Laura that she would be arriving that evening. However, before leaving, she wanted to talk to David again to inform him of her decision. David returned home at about 5 o'clock in the evening and found Emily in the process of packing. When he saw her bag, he panicked and started asking questions. Emily said that she was leaving for a few days to think about their future. She added that she knew more about his past than he thought and mentioned the documents from Chris. This was the last straw for David. He started shouting, accusing Emily of betraying him and threatening that she would regret it if she told anyone about his secret. The argument lasted for about half an hour. Neighbors later reported hearing loud voices and the sound of dishes breaking. Emily tried to calm David down, but he became increasingly aggressive. At one point, she grabbed her phone to call Laura, but David snatched it from her hands. Emily retreated to the kitchen, where her laptop and papers were lying on the table. She tried to gather the documents, but David followed her. The situation got out of hand, and a physical altercation broke out in the house. Emily tried to defend herself, but David, overcome with emotion, did not hold back. By 7 p.m., the Wilsons' house was quiet. Laura, having received no response to her messages, became worried and called Emily, but no one answered. She decided to drive to a friend's house. Arriving around 8 p.m., Laura noticed that the lights were on in the house, but the door was locked. She knocked, but no one answered. Laura called the police, saying she was worried about Emily's safety. The police arrived 20 minutes later and entered the house, finding evidence of a struggle in the kitchen, an overturned chair, a broken plate, and stains on the floor. Emily was found in critical condition. She was taken to hospital but could not be saved. David disappeared from the house, leaving his phone and car behind. Police issued a warrant for him, launching an investigation that shocked Caldwell. Investigators collected evidence, including Emily's laptop, documents, and a flash drive, to piece together a timeline of events. On October 27, 2014, Caldwell, Idaho was in shock. News of the tragedy at the Wilson home spread quickly, and the small town was abuzz with rumors. Emily Wilson, a beloved teacher, had died in the hospital from her injuries. Her husband, David Wilson, had disappeared, and police named him the prime suspect. An investigation began immediately, with investigators trying to piece together the events that led to the fatal shooting. Police searched the Wilson home and found key evidence: Emily's laptop, a flash drive from Chris Larson, and printed documents related to David's past. There were signs of a struggle on the kitchen floor, and a torn-up photograph from Seattle was found in the trash. Emily's phone contained messages with Chris and Laura Clark, which helped establish a timeline. Investigators contacted Chris, who was in Nampa. He confirmed that he had provided Emily with information about David's transgender past, but insisted that he had no intention of causing a conflict. Chris said he knew David as Daniel in the 2000s and was hurt by his decision to cut off contact after he transitioned. David was arrested on October 29th at a motel in Boise, 25 miles from Caldwell. He offered no resistance and agreed to cooperate. When questioned, David admitted that on October 26th, an argument with Emily turned physical. He claimed he did not mean to hurt her, but lost control when she threatened to reveal his secret. David insisted he acted in a state of panic, fearing the loss of his job and reputation. His version of events was partially supported by evidence, but police classified the case as a felony. The trial began in March 2015. David was charged with manslaughter resulting in death. His lawyers emphasized that he did not plan the tragedy and was under severe emotional pressure. The prosecution pointed to a deliberate escalation of the conflict. In May 2015, the court found David guilty, sentencing him to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years. The Wilson case left a deep mark on Caldwell. Residents discussed how secrets and unspoken words can destroy a family. Laura Clark organized a memorial at Emily's school to honor her memory. Chris Larson left Idaho shortly after the trial, and his fate is unknown. Emily and David's story was a reminder of the importance of open communication in relationships and how hidden truths can have lasting consequences.